Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Business BoardCast on a lovely sunny Friday afternoon. So today I'd like to welcome my guest, Dr Naeema Pasha. Hi, Naeema.
Hello.
So today we've got really interesting discussion because we're discussing about retention and improvement within your teams, but also from two parts of perspectives, from an AI perspective and also diversity perspective, because what we obviously all want as business owners is we want our teams to be engaged, we want them to stay, we want them to have improved performance. And Naeema's a real expert in these areas and has got lots of fascinating things to share with us today. So I'm going to stop talking because Naeema's got much more interesting things to say than me. But first of all, so Naeema, just to introduce yourself and just sort of see from what our starting point is today. But as always, to everybody, please do say hello in the comments because it's always lovely to see who's watching live. I know that a lot of you will be watching on catch up, and also we're always welcome interesting questions or even any question. Doesn't even have to be interesting. Any question, we're always happy to answer. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's fantastic to be here and link with you again, Nikki. I was just saying before we spoke all the amazing work you do, and I'm so impressed by it, and have been for the many years, and all the great work you do. And I still kind of remember the advice and support you gave me when I was starting out as well in running my business. So thank you for having me here. I'm really honoured, and it's a pleasure to be connected again on such a beautiful day.
Thank you. And I remember when I first met you as well. It was when we were based over in Arlington Business Park, and now we've been in Theo Lakes for 10 years, and we're now back at Arlington Business Park, which sort of really dates how long it's been. So
yeah, that was it. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I learned so much in that time. So yeah, as you say, I've since then, since we met back then, my work has taken me much more, because I started off, I think it's probably just give you an arc of what I've done and therefore why you invited me here today. So I'm really interested in how people work, and I'm interested in us as workers. I'm interested in workplaces. I'm interested in the work itself. And through that, I really kind of developed my work, particularly in Henley Business School, where I went to soon after we connected, and I was heading up the career and professional development there, sort of working on people to help them, develop their career. And that was from undergraduates, starting out in their career, all the way through to people who were mid-career, towards sort of board level, C-suite, or people just changing jobs, throughout their career, and sort of working with them on that. And then as I kind of and the things I used to talk about was their, understanding their skills, understanding their motivation, understanding their values, and then working with organizations. And so they would talk about their values, the skills they were looking for, and, looking at how we could combine the two together and really work around those kind of areas. But what I found more and more, as we all will, is that that sounds almost transactional in a way, that we kind of work on our skills and experience, and we try and match that up to the environment around us. But the environment is changing so rapidly with the impact, and particularly my focus started looking at the impact of artificial intelligence on skills, how automation is changing the work, how we've moved into, obviously since the pandemic, more remote working, hybrid workplaces. And then that changes the whole dynamic, not just in terms of skills, but expectations. And as you talked about at the beginning about how we engage our staff, how we stay engaged, things around productivity, I started linking that much further to this environment that we're in, and these sort of looking at things called mega trends that are coming in to sort of change how we can start working. And then so doing a whole set of things around that. And I set up at Henley Business School the World of Work Institute, which is still running and looking at the world of work and how, things like AI and so on, but other things as well, 4-day week, all these kind of things that we're all playing with. But then I started looking more and more into how people are engaged at work, how they are, stay on, and also the barriers that, that stop people progressing. And so then it took another stage to start looking much more about the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Now, that's not to say that this is, because I didn't actually think I was going to go into this area, but then I became director of that field as well, director of diversity, because it's all linked up. If we want to enable people to do well, and if we want to do well, and we want our staff to do well, we've got to understand the environment around us and how that's going to change, and keep up kind of understanding the impact of the kind of things like AI and things like what we hear on the news all the time now is ChatGPT, all those kind of large language models that are out there, but also how we look at things like diversity and sustainability to some extent, but that's not my area of expertise. But so I really kind of started looking much more on that, and I did a lot of research and ran the teams around diversity. So I've just got all this sort of knowledge, which I put into a book I co-wrote called Future Proof Your Career, which is out a couple of years ago now. But that was really kind of pulling all these things together, and what we could do as people to sort of to ride this wave that we're on at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, it's fascinating to see how all these things link up, and how, really shouldn't be just looking at these things in isolation. But sort of tapping in on one of those parts with the diversity element, what can you share with the audience of the research out there or evidence that there is about how making sure that you have good diversity impacts your bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually this is kind of really important to think about. So I've got the work I did in leading diversity at Henley. I ran a research project there. We produced a paper called The Equity Effect, and if people go to Henley Business School, you can download it still from there. But it looked at race equity in particular, to see what the impact was that from a business perspective, and we looked at UK businesses. And we looked, it was both a quantitative study looking at business leaders and employees, look at perspectives from them, and also did some qualitative research to sort of really dig deeper and get some case studies and stories out. And we worked with organizations as well to see where they put that in. And the title we put for this is Engage and Retain Your Team. The tweak you can't miss. It reminds me of those like things that you get on this trick that doctors don't want you to know, that kind of thing that you see at the end of some kind of social media thing, or at the bottom of those ads when you're looking through a funny newspaper or something. So yeah, this thing was that if you could start working, what we found is that organizations, to be very clear about this, organizations that invested in race equity, this is race equity, but I'll talk about other equity as well. If those organizations that invested in race equity had a 58% increase in revenue than those that didn't. And this was absolutely remarkable. And I thought, well, wow, this is a big figure. And we looked at the FTSE 300, and we took out outliers and looked at, sort of the kind of middle kind of group of organizations, large organizations, small, people from different industries. And it was, however way you cut it, that was the data. Then we looked at other kind of, obviously looking at the literature on this. It's been done quite a lot to look at diversity, but also consultancy firms like McKinsey and BCG have also run the same thing, and they came to the same conclusions. In fact, McKinsey's research shows that race equity increases a business bottom line even more than gender equity and LGBTQ equity. And that's, I feel, because once an organization starts addressing race equity, which is quite a hard subject to go about, it's got a lot of emotion in it, actually just thinking we're going to go for this, it also pulls up gender equity, LGBTQ equity, disability, ageism, all the kinds of things that we did. In fact, amazingly, in the research, we found that those organizations that invested in race equity also started improving their orientation around sustainability as well. So it was kind of almost the organization thought, right, who are we? What do we stand for? And once they started going down that route, there was so many benefits that came through it. So it was a remarkable bit. I found really interesting piece of work to have done.
Absolutely, that's very interesting. So yeah, I can sort of see that though, that yeah, if people are thinking more detailed about making sure there's fairness and diversity and everything in all the different areas, then of course that's going to flow through. And but it's yeah, very very interesting. So I'm always looking out at the ratios on the boards, because I suppose the research you've been doing is across the organisation, but there's also a lot of research just on the board mixes as well, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was also part of the work that I sort of followed up with, to look at mixture of board work, looking at C-suite as well. And it really was clear. And as you say, I mean, first of all, I was like, wow, this is a bit of a surprise. This is, I mean, 58%. But really, as you just pointed out, this correlation shouldn't be any surprise. A correlation with businesses that committed to supporting their people, and financial performance is quite well, the literature is quite strong on it. But essentially, if we all go to a workplace and we feel supported and embraced, and it's an equitable, inclusive workplace, we're going to find people feel that they can be themselves. That will then lead to what we looked at was like people start feeling that they're more engaged. That can lead to feeling that they can think of ideas. You can get innovation, creativity, problem solving, or working on the kind of areas that they need to. And all that basically means that, those organizations will start to outperform those organizations that don't. So it was really, really interesting. And I'll give you some stats from that data in a minute if you want.
Oh, yeah, I always love the stats.
We love the stats. Well, I know. So what we found on that is that when we looked at race inequality, and it was called the equity effect. Let me just explain why we looked at the equity effect specifically, and we called it equity rather than equality. Is that what we found is that we don't, what we didn't want to do is to alienate people, so people will feel, and there's a lot of language can feel quite alienating, like privilege and fragility and so on around this. And so I wanted to sort of steer away from that and just keep this business case quite strong around it, or look at the business case rather. And so it was important when I explain equity, it's not to say that people haven't had, whatever background you have, not to say that you haven't had a difficult life, or groups of people in the organization won't have received discrimination and go through hard times at home, and then having there's a lot, we're all living this life, and especially at the moment we talked briefly about interest rates and the cost of living and so on. Everyone's feeling it. So we might feel, well, that seems a little bit unfair that we're talking about one group when we're all feeling it, and we've all been held back from promotions or not got particular things. So it was important to sort of acknowledge that, I think, and that's what I did want to do. But what we was to describe equity, perhaps, and the way I've kind of described it is that if you go to a supermarket, an equality approach should be, and you drive there, the equality, everybody gets a chance to get a parking space. Everybody grab the parking space, and it's an equal approach. But now we've got used to supermarkets, which will have spaces at the front for people with mobility issues, young children, caring responsibilities. And we're probably, most of us, some of us might feel, I'm not really sure about that, but most people think that seems fair. If folks have to go right at the back of ASDA and fight their way through, say if they're a wheelchair user or with young children, and get the whole thing, it doesn't seem fair. So equity is really about balancing those things when we can look at them in the round, as it were. So that's why we looked at equity in the workplace and race and racism. What we found was 30% of business leaders found that race inequity still was in their organization, rising to higher in certain organizations. And what we found is that minority business leaders found that saw it more obviously, and that's probably because that whole personal experience that they have can make it more prevalent. And they talked about the range of kind of experiences that they had. But one of the other things we found was that when people saw discrimination, they weren't necessarily from a discriminated group. 22% we found personally saw discrimination, and that made them feel uncomfortable. So it's not just the person receiving discrimination. It's horrible, isn't it? Sometimes if we're out, we see somebody shouting in the car park or something, like going back to Asda car park. It makes us feel uncomfortable as well. So if we're having it, and if organizations kind of enable or allow that to happen, it can affect wider areas. And when we looked at discrimination itself, people said that yes, they saw discrimination, but they found 55% said it was race was the primary thing. And that's just because I think we've got a very society that's got racial mix in the UK, and whole range of things. And what they said, a few more stats quickly on that, was that over half of the employees and business leaders said it was cultural differences that and lack of understanding that perhaps led to some of these things. 56% of employees said that. Half of employees felt that it was particularly prevalent in their organizations. But what we also found is, which is important to say, is that the reason why nobody wants to be horrible in the workplace. People do want equitable workplaces, but we found that why things weren't progressing is that people were really worried about going into something that they felt a bit uncomfortable in. Perhaps did they know the language to use, and all those kind of things that we found.
We've had an interesting comment from Susan Marie saying about equity is misunderstood. This year's International Women's Day proved that as many companies' messaging was actually still about equality and not equity. I know she always has. She's talked to. I know she talks a lot about that, and also about disability discrimination, etc. Making sure there's quite equity. So, I just wonder if you had any thoughts on
absolutely,
and the efficacy of International Women's Day and similar things like that.
I completely agree. I mean, what we found was just on race equity, 24% of people said that they experienced discrimination, not just sort of uncomfortableness. And what we found in that is that women experienced it even more. So the most discriminated group were Black women in the workplace. So we've got and older Black women as well, particularly. So age, gender, and race coming into the play as well. So, and in fact, I would say, just as inside before I answer that one, is that when an organization says which group of people are the most discriminated, why don't we start looking at how we can support those with meaningful ways? They were more likely to start making a difference. And so, absolutely right that organizations will put things out on International Women's Day, Pride Month at the moment, other things, and it's really important. I don't need to say this, but it's really important to sort of say this is why it matters, and to gather the data of where it isn't working at the moment. And therefore, when you put out information on social media or in value statements or whatever we're looking at, that it comes from knowledge of your own organization and where improvements are being made and how those improvements are really kind of are progressing across all kind of areas.
I mean, so many times it just seems like it's like some appropriate photos put out and they're not actually necessarily embedded in the organization to make things better, which is a shame. It should be something that people are thinking about all the time, not just on one day. So I do get a bit wound up about it too. Excellent. So we've talked about the impact and about why we're starting on that particular area, the different particular areas it could be. So the other thing we were thinking about was the hurdles that leaders often have in businesses. What sort of hurdles are there, and how can they be knocked down?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really what we want to do, I think. And what we found, I'll just throw some more stats again, if I may. So nearly 30% of people who were kind of worried about how to start this were found that they said the fear of causing resentment by using, as I said, the wrong or insensitive terminology. And that was actually one of the key barriers to achieving success in organizational diversity and inclusion. And that's across all areas. And what people from perhaps marginalized groups said, 34% actually said they felt that there was a lack of understanding as the root cause about why people weren't coming forward, and they interpreted that 26%, so a quarter of people saying that was lack of empathy, and similarly openness, and what they felt is the things that needed to change had to really come from the leaders, the business leaders, to say this is who we are and this is what we need to stand for and how we can progress. And I working in this field around diversity, but which is a subset of the work I do around AI and other kind of things as well, is that just kind of, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's really kind of like people kind of had to kind of almost like, I'm gonna learn about this because it's important, particularly from a business leader perspective, and thinking, what I'm going to do is to develop some solutions which are based on, I understand I'm wary about this, but I've got to perhaps think this actually translates to perceived lack of empathy and understanding by some people. That's from women in organizations, if they're feeling that's not really understanding. We talk a lot about menopause and other things at the moment, and we're thinking that it's important for people to say that this is what we've got to move forward on. And when I was in this area, a lot of the work around diversity comes from the kind of like social justice area, which I completely applaud and I support. And without that, we wouldn't have progressed as far as we can. And that's from women's movements to get, all the way back from equal rights to maternity pay and all sorts of, things that we're looking for, and time off and parental leave, and a whole bunch of things that organizations are now adopting or have adopted and need to move further. But it's important, I feel, from my perspective, that I really want to push the business argument, because that's where I come from and that's the data I have. And it's to acknowledge the importance of this moral argument that we might have in organization, and legal argument as well, as you'll no doubt say. But the business case,
in fact, Susan does point out about the HR policies. It's got to be everywhere, whereas a lot of places aren't always focusing on in the handbooks and things aren't
thank you for that. And I find that I would say that HR, I'll call myself a little bit HR. I'm not HR, but I feel HR-ish in my sense, is that and this is across all HR arguments to some extent, when we keep something in a pocket in an organization, whether we keep it in finance or we keep it in the sales team or we keep it in the HR team, the cross-functional doesn't work as well. And this is where the leaders need to come and take place, because if we take this as this is a business argument for us to get better revenue, better growth, improve our stakeholders with our customers, improve retention and engagement with our staff, and just improve our image with the wider public, then we can start thinking this is going to help. And the data is so strong, 58% from the research I did, increase in revenue, but that is echoed across everybody. And it should make complete sense. You're including your organizations, and you're also not just being inclusive, you're stopping discrimination as well. You've got to look at your discrimination.
You're reflecting your client base.
You're reflecting your client base, exactly. So if we start thinking this is the target, why are we not taking more women to board level? What is the runway that gets there? What's stopping people? And then you can see there was some work done on I know you're familiar with a law firm, and I can't remember the name of the company, but looking at why women were not going through into senior leadership and partner level. And what the piece of work really that they were looking at is that the women through themselves and their managers were taking on projects that were interesting but didn't lead to promotion, whereas male counterparts were only taking on the promotional prospects. And so it needed work from the leaders, from the senior partners, to say, right, this is how work is going to be allocated. But that only came through when they started looking at the data. And I'm going back to the data again. And that's what HR will probably need to do. So we produced the policies about discriminatory language. Let's work this way. Let's try and be more open in our how we recruit and how we train. But actually HR really having a seat at the table, or pushing for a seat at the table, for a voice at the C-suite, is really how we're going to start moving things forward. When it is a business argument, which is why I say I'm quite wedded to the business argument, particularly on this, and that's why, because I think it's massive.
No, absolutely, and that's why all the research that you do and colleagues do, that your colleagues do, so important, because that's what if you can cut through all the emotional talk about everything and just go, look, this is the business case, this is your return on investment. If you do these things, you will increase your profit, your income, whatever, by 58%. That's huge. How can people argue with that? If you've got really great, and that's why I love having the stats, because it pulls it through, and it's I love it. Okay, we haven't even touched.
I was just going to quickly say, because I was going to mention, because I was at a conference yesterday looking at ChatGPT, looking at that influence, and I just wanted to say that organizations, including HR, actually are probably using these kind of tools in the workplace. And I just want to say some of the things around AI and the work I'm doing with MKI as their director of research is looking at how we need to really ensure that's really equitable as well, because the research on that is ChatGPT is actually got biases in it. So if HR were using it, for example, in producing job adverts for it, the data is still that it's got 40% more bias than a human writing an advert as well. So some of the research that's come through. So because it's going up.
What bias does it have?
Bias towards to what you'd expect, actually, around gender, race, ethnicity, class, all that kind of thing. So because it's working on what's already there, it's not innate.
So it's perpetuating already there.
Exactly. So that's why all the hype that we see around ChatGPT and things is really.
You always think about computers being fair in that, but of course, with that, it's just
very that in fact, that's the work I'm really kind of hoping to work on a lot more now. So thank you.
Wow, there's just so much. I mean, we'd love to have you back and really get into the detail on the AI and some more on the diversity, some more practical steps as well, because it's just a fabulous area, and it's really important for businesses. A lot of businesses are really having to wake up and think, well, what is my business going to be looking like in the next few years? Because there's so much, there's so much threat out there of interest rates, inflation, war, etc., but also so much change with with AI, etc., and and the changing profile of workplaces. So there's so much. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant time to be in your sector, I would have thought. It's so interesting. So much stuff going on. So I'd love to, if you have time, it'd be great if you can come back later in the year. That would be fabulous. Thank you so much.
No, I'd love to, and I've got more practical things that people can take away as well.
Fantastic.
So thank you.
I'm sorry, I've got I'm trying to think what our next week's who next week's guest is. Just one moment. Just a reminder, we've got we're carrying on Business BoardCast up until end of July. I can't think who the thing is next week. I haven't got my book with me, but it will be obviously a fabulous talk next week. Also, just anyone watching, especially the regulars, we are thinking because we're having August off, coming back September, we are thinking about changing the time and day of this. So we've been doing this Friday lunchtimes for a couple of years, but we have had some suggestions whether to do it on a different day and time. So we are thinking potentially a Wednesday early evening. So please do give me feedback about if you think that could work, or another time or anything. That would be really interesting before we do a big change. But anyway, have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for all the numbers. That just made my day, just having all the stats. So that was fabulous. I look forward to reading more of your research and sharing it more with everybody in the next few months. Thank you very much, and everyone have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.